Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this feedback session on the National Impact Agenda, also known as Leading the Change Together. My name is Dee Gao. I am Senior Director of Research and Development at the National Trust. And today I'm speaking on behalf of a broader team of National Trust staffers who've been working on this initiative for the past year, many of whom you'll meet later on through the breakout groups that will form the bulk of today's feedback session. Next slide, please. You've heard references to the National Impact Agenda throughout the conference this year, and during our session today, we hope that you all will feel comfortable to actively participate and provide constructive feedback on what we're hearing and what we're synthesizing, and add your voice to this strategic vision for change for the preservation movement. As a preview of what's coming, I'll be giving a brief 15-minute presentation on the draft framework itself to set the stage for the smaller breakout discussions. And in those discussions, we'd really love to hear your feedback and your ideas for positive change in preservation practice nationally. As a bit of background, according to a 2021 Penn Praxis survey on preservation and change, which reached over 2,000 respondents connected to preservation in some way, 84% of respondents expressed desire for substantive change in preservation practice. And staff at the National Trust have heard these calls for change echoed through many focus groups we've held over the past year, which have reached over 600 people and counting. And we've been asking people across the field about their ideas for how we can achieve the change we want to see in the field. And in return, we've heard a wide range of perspectives regarding the future of preservation today. It's worth noting that the engagement that's at the core of this effort has been conducted in an all virtual setting, and in the context of a challenging and polarized time for our country. Across many ideas for change, we heard notable disagreements, no doubt, but we also found areas of common ground which have really inspired us and showed us a more collaborative and better path forward. This process has expanded our understanding of what inclusive outreach means across a national movement that encompasses so many different practice areas and communities and identities. And we've recognized that we have more work to do to revolutionize how we think about inclusive outreach today. But through this experience that I've had the honor of partaking in this effort of facilitating a national impact agenda, we are seeing how this simple act of creating space for these discussions and connecting people who don't normally get to talk to one another across the country is building bridges across the preservation movement today. And we're very grateful for all of the hundreds of people who have participated in this agenda so far, and want to acknowledge that this work is just beginning and is by no means done. And we also published a document on acknowledging all of those who participated and contributed to this effort to date. And you can see who we all reached so far at the link in the chat by downloading this document that my colleague Amy has provided. So now we'd like to share a distillation of what we've heard so far. The first topic we sought feedback on are the principles that guide preservationists today. And in poll after poll, we heard that people are motivated by a wide range of principles, from saving tangible and intangible history for future generations to advancing social justice and much more. We also know that the preservation field is not a monolith, and some people are motivated by many of these principles and some are motivated by just a few. And we wanted to capture in this agenda an inclusive list of what motivates each of us in our practice areas and lives every day. And we expect this list to continue to grow and shift as it already has as we continue to gather more public input, which is why conversations like today are so important. Based on these 7 goals, we asked people what goals the preservation movement should focus on collectively over the next 5 years. And our team has synthesized 7 goals out of the many ideas we've heard. Each of these 7 goals aspires to represent a steady state positive outcome for the preservation field. We tried to focus on what we heard most frequently across groups from a wide range of perspectives, and we also tried to create a set of goals that would be relevant across many sectors in preservation today. Whether you work as an interpretation specialist, at a historic site, as a policymaker, or are a community member passionate about preserving local history, we hope that people from diverse areas within preservation will be able to see their priorities reflected here. I would also note that this draft framework is available to be downloaded online, which my colleagues have shared in the chat. And I urge you to take a moment to download it if you haven't done so already. And I'd like to just briefly walk through each of these goals and pause on them for a second, based on what we've synthesized so far. The first goal, growing collaborative networks. More specifically, we heard about the need to build networks of support for smaller, newer organizations that are at the grassroots and on the front lines of change. A representative movement. We heard calls to diversify staff, practitioners, as well as the boards and leadership of preservation organizations to cultivate true inclusion in the preservation field. Modernized tools. Across almost every sector we spoke to, we heard that there were opportunities to expand and update the tools that we use to make it easier to practice the principles that motivate us in our work. In terms of equitable communities, we continue to hear increased calls for preservation to be a path toward equity and for increased accountability to community needs when preservation has the power to address them. Urgent work is needed to ensure that preservation is part of the solution in climate change, specifically with regard to mitigation and disaster preparedness strategies. And we heard echoed again and again over the past few days, a desire to make preservation more accessible and relevant through innovative communication and storytelling. And last, but certainly not least, the need to expand truth-telling of a multi-layered history and to harness the power of historic places and the stories that only they can tell. So we're now at a point where we have listened and synthesized and are reflecting out to the field what we've heard to date so that we can continue to build on these ideas together. This is an iterative process, and we are receiving new ideas every day for how we can make these goals more representative of the priorities of the movement. And I'll take us through a sample of how we plan to build out each goal as we continue to build out the agenda, which will live online on savingplaces.org. The topic of modernizing and creating new tools and practices came up again and again in discussions across sectors. And using this goal as an example, you can see that each of the 7 goals will be complemented with 4 components. Goal context, which is a description and an elaboration on the goal itself, case studies that our partners are leading across the country, crowdsourced ideas for concrete actions that anyone can take to create change, as well as an articulation of the National Trust's own commitments to action. Each of these components is based on what we heard would be the most helpful to the field through our feedback. Generally, we heard that people were seeking more direction on where the national movement is headed, that people wanted to hear their concrete ideas for change shared more broadly, and that people wanted to know what the National Trust and other leaders across the field are doing to follow through to turn these ideas into action. So the first component is a description, and I won't dwell on that, but the second component is case studies. As hopefully many of you have seen, So many of the incredible sessions at this conference have demonstrated that boundary pushing work is taking place across the country every single day. And these case studies will demonstrate that progress in each of these goals is ongoing, and that there are many ways in which change is being led collaboratively across the field today. Here we list some examples, just a sample of examples that we've come across that have inspired us from at the federal, regional, state, and local levels that really demonstrate the breadth of work that is creating positive change today. And we also feel that by elevating case studies, it will play an integral part in how we can demonstrate what leadership looks like across different sectors, and to help people see their own role in change, no matter where we are in the preservation movement. In terms of crowdsourced actions, this is where we transition from some of the more abstract concepts of the goals themselves to something a bit more concrete, these specific strategies and tactics that people felt would help create the change we all want to see. In these concrete ideas for action, we feel the agenda really begins to come alive. And here are just a few examples of what some of the crowdsourced actions we heard are. But I would encourage you to download the framework, which is 6 pages and contains sample actions for each of the 7 goals. Ideas you can see here include how we can increase equitable access to resources for smaller organizations, and how we can make preservation guidelines more flexible. Just to call out a few. And the idea behind these actions is we recognize that not all of these actions will apply to everyone, but they do represent how we can begin to take steps, large and small, towards change. And by elevating what others are saying across the field, what others are saying and doing, we hope that we can create a public resource that will inspire others to identify further actions and also help coordinate across silos. The 4th piece is focused on articulating the National Trust's own commitments to action, which we see as a critical piece of implementation and accountability. And while we plan to start by identifying and putting our own commitments on the table, we would like to encourage others and other leaders to do the same. Some, but not all, of the National Trust commitments that we can already see aligning with this framework include our advocacy around historic tax credits, the growing number of grant programs to tell a truer story. And we're really excited to see how this emerging framework can help prioritize existing and future work and inspire additional actions from both within the Trust and from other leaders across the country. So before we go into breakout groups, I would like to share some next steps on where we're headed. We aim to, once we have a chance to integrate all of the feedback that we receive at PastForward and beyond, we aim to develop a web presence for the National Impact Agenda that will share the 4 components that we just talked about, but also allow for more exposure and public input. And a critical component of this project is follow through and accountability. And one way we plan to follow through on the National Impact Agenda is to continue to talk about progress toward these goals and hold each other accountable at future National Trust conferences in Miami and in DC, when we're all hopefully back together in person. So that concludes the presentation portion of today's session. Thank you for listening. And in just a moment, we're going to be inviting you to join a breakout room. Our goal for the breakout sessions is to hear your general reactions to what we've been hearing and synthesizing, and to crowdsource some additional ideas for case studies and concrete actions for change. And lastly, we'd also like to brainstorm how we can begin to measure this progress so we can hold each other accountable. These questions have been dropped in the chat, and they will also be shared with you in the breakout sessions themselves, but please consider them as we begin the kind of interactive portion. So I will see you back here in about 35 minutes, and hope you all have some great discussions.
I think we're all back.
Thanks, Renee. Great. Well, thank you all for participating today, and welcome back to the main room. We hope you all had some thought-provoking conversations in the breakouts, and we look forward to sharing and sifting through what you all discussed today. We would love to keep the feedback loop open and continue to hear your thoughts. If any other ideas come to you that you would like to make sure are heard, please feel free to get in touch with us in a number of ways. You can email us at the National Impact Agenda, National Impact Agenda at savingplaces.org. There is also a message board wall to the left-hand side panel on your screen on the Socio platform, the virtual platform for viewing the conference, where there is an active messaging board where you can access all of the documents associated with the draft framework as it stands today and continue to offer feedback. And of course, you can visit savingplaces.org at /impact agenda for continued updates. And we just really want to thank you again for your thoughtful participation today. And we hope you will join us at the award ceremony in just a few moments. We would like to give you a brief break before we all reconvene there. So thank you all again, and look forward to continuing the conversation.